I still remember that night as if it were etched into my skin. The sound of her voice, sharp, harsh, impossible to ignore, echoing across the small study room where I had been sitting for hours. My textbooks lay open, pages filled with meticulous notes, highlighters marking the words that I had repeated over and over until they made sense. But none of it mattered, not to her. Stop being lazy, she had shouted. Her words slammed into me, heavy and sudden, and for a moment I froze. I was 21, recovering from months of late nights and exams, my whole future teetering on the edge of every grade I earned. And yet, in that moment, she saw me not as a young woman trying to chase a dream, but as a burden, someone to belittle, someone to correct. I looked up at her, my hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the keyboard I had been using to finalize my med school application. I opened my mouth, trying to explain. I'm not being lazy. You're just sitting there, daydreaming while the rest of us work. She interrupted, laughing in that hollow way that never touched her eyes. Her laughter wasn't warm. It wasn't soft. It was sharp and cutting, and it wrapped around me like a cold wind, leaving me exposed. I wanted to tell her the truth, the small, vulnerable truth I kept tucked inside my chest. I wanted to tell her that every letter I typed, every application I submitted, every hour I stayed awake memorizing anatomy and chemistry formulas was part of the life I had promised myself, a life she seemed determined to dismiss, but words stuck in my throat. She had a way of making me feel foolish, even when I was doing exactly what I needed to do. I remember swallowing hard, my throat dry, and nodding silently. I kept typing. My fingers shook, but I kept going, forcing myself to finish the application that had consumed my nights for weeks. In that room, in that moment, her disbelief was heavier than any exhaustion I had ever felt. I had learned over the years that arguing with her only gave her power. Silence at least gave me control over myself. After she left, slamming the door behind her, I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. My chest ached with frustration, not just at her, but at the quiet realization that the people who were supposed to believe in me sometimes wouldn't. I had trusted them. I had let myself hope that family meant support, encouragement, even kindness. But trust, I was learning, was fragile, especially when it met pride or stubbornness. I leaned back in my chair, trying to steady my breathing. My heart was pounding not from fear, but from a strange mix of anger and sorrow. Anger at being underestimated, sorrow at knowing that her words reflected not me, but her inability to see beyond her own narrow expectations. I realized then that her laughter wasn't about me at all. It was about her need to feel superior, to define what was worthy and what was not. That night, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not let her disbelief dictate my life. I would not shrink to fit the mold she imagined. Every rejection, every dismissal, every harsh word, I would let it pass through me like water over stones. I would continue quietly, relentlessly, toward the future I wanted. Hours later, the house was silent, and I finally allowed myself a small sigh. My eyes scanned the page, my fingers poised above the keyboard, and I pressed submit. It was a small act, almost invisible, yet monumental in its significance. In that quiet act, I reclaimed a piece of myself that her words had tried to take. I didn't celebrate that night. There was no fanfare, no congratulations, just the soft glow of the screen, the sound of my own steady breath, and the growing awareness that the world beyond her judgments was mine to navigate. And in that awareness, in that silence, I began to understand a truth that would carry me far beyond her laughter. The most important validation doesn't come from others. It comes from within. That night, I fell asleep with the weight of her disbelief pressing against me, but also with a strange, delicate hope. A hope that no matter how loudly someone tried to tell me I was lazy, My own quiet persistence could speak louder, and in that quiet I began to find the first flicker of strength I didn't yet know I possessed. After that night, something shifted quietly inside me. Not violently, not suddenly, but subtly, like the turning of a season that no one notices until the leaves begin to fall. I stopped speaking first. I stopped offering explanations, stopped defending my dreams, stopped reaching for the approval that seemed to evaporate the moment I tried to claim it. In the mornings, I would see her moving around the kitchen, her voice cheerful, almost careless, and I learned to smile without really smiling, to nod without agreeing, to exist without needing validation. I realized that her laughter, her sharp words, were not a reflection of my worth but of her own limitations. And though it stung, I could no longer allow it to shape me. School became my refuge, not because it was easy, not because it was simple, but because in those classrooms, in those late nights hunched over textbooks and notes, I controlled the narrative. My family might see me as lazy or frivolous, but here, in my own silence, I was disciplined, deliberate, unstoppable in ways they could not recognize. And yet, the house remained a place of quiet tension. Dinner conversations were polite but shallow. I stopped sharing my victories, my little joys, the small triumphs that once would have earned a smile. I noticed things I had never truly seen before: the way her eyes flickered when she thought no one was looking, the way my stepfather's compliments always carried a hint of calculation, the way certain relatives only appeared when there was something to gain. I began keeping my life in layers. One layer for the outside world, polite, agreeable, calm. Another layer, deeper, private, where my ambitions, my dreams, and my disappointments were stored safely, out of reach. I learned to observe quietly, to notice patterns without comment, to feel deeply without speaking. One evening, a family gathering made it all painfully clear. My stepmom, laughing with relatives, mentioned something about lazy children, and how some people never amounted to much without constant reminders. My stomach twisted. They weren't talking about me, at least, not directly, but the undertone was unmistakable. I could feel their assumptions wrapping around me, invisible chains made of judgment and expectation. And I realized that in this house, words could wound far more than actions, and silence could protect far more than confrontation. I began to notice the little contradictions, too. The stories she told others rarely matched the reality I observed. Things disappeared from the kitchen, bills were paid late, promises were broken. And yet, she presented an image of perfection, a mask that hid the small selfishness and manipulation that I had come to recognize. I didn't speak, I just watched, I stored it, quietly cataloging every discrepancy, every hidden agenda, every whispered insult. It was during those long hours of quiet observation that I started to understand something vital. People reveal themselves not through what they say in anger, but through what they try to hide. And the more I observed, the more I realized how much control I had over my own life. If I simply chose to act carefully, thoughtfully, and deliberately, I stopped being reactive. I stopped trying to explain myself. I stopped needing them to see me as I was. And in that stopping, I found a strange kind of power, a calm, grounded power that came from knowing my own mind, my own abilities, and my own worth, regardless of anyone else's opinions. Even as the world of the house seemed designed to undermine me, I kept applying myself to my dreams in silence. I applied to med schools quietly, meticulously, without announcing it, without seeking permission or approval. I knew the long nights and the sacrifices were mine alone, and no one could diminish that work without my consent. It was not a loud, triumphant defiance. It was quiet, intentional, and invisible. I began to understand that the real strength lay not in proving anyone wrong in the moment, but in creating a future that spoke for itself. I would let my life do the talking, while their assumptions and judgments withered quietly in the background. By the time the acceptance letter finally arrived, I was ready, not angry, not desperate, ready. Because I had already lived through months of dismissal and quiet betrayal, months of observing without speaking, and months of cultivating a resilience that could not be shaken by laughter, sarcasm, or disbelief. That night, when I opened the envelope with the university seal, the joy was private, profound, and unshakable. I didn't need to scream, didn't need to fight, didn't need to argue. I simply allowed myself a quiet smile, a soft exhale, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that my life was finally beginning to belong entirely to me. The acceptance letter arrived on a Monday morning, tucked neatly in a crisp envelope, the seal almost glowing under the kitchen light. I carried it in my hands like a fragile secret, aware that to reveal it too soon would only invite judgment, doubt, and maybe even ridicule. For years, I had been careful about what I shared, choosing silence over explanation, observation over confrontation. This moment would be no different. She was in the living room when I walked past, chatting with a friend on the phone, laughter spilling around her in waves that seemed deliberately calculated, like a performance. I could feel the weight of her gaze even when she wasn't looking directly at me. For a moment, a tiny part of me considered showing her the letter, letting her know, seeking the acknowledgement I had been denied. But I remembered the nights spent defending my dreams, the words mocked, the effort dismissed. No, that satisfaction would be private. That victory would belong solely to me. I slipped the letter into my bag and retreated to my room, closing the door softly behind me. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe without hesitation, without the unspoken tension of scrutiny pressing down on me. I read the words carefully, savoring each sentence, each line that confirmed what I had worked for, what I had believed in when no one else did. Acceptance to med school, the culmination of years of study, sacrifice, and silent persistence. And then I began to notice the small shifts around the house, subtle but unmistakable. Conversations hushed when I entered a room. My stepmom's laughter, once careless and sharp, now occasionally faltered, as if she were aware, subconsciously, that she had underestimated me. She said nothing, but I could see the recognition dawning in the corners of her eyes, the brief flickers that betrayed surprise or maybe even regret. I watched my stepfather, too, though with more quiet calculation. He had always been generous with advice and warnings, often veiled criticisms that lingered longer than necessary. But recently, he seemed to measure his words, pausing before speaking, as if recalculating what he thought he knew about me. I realized then that respect is rarely demanded. It is observed, earned, and noticed quietly, without spectacle. And here, my life, moving forward in silent triumph, was beginning to speak louder than any argument or explanation ever could. For days I carried the letter with me, never opening it in public, never allowing it to be a trophy displayed for approval. It was a private affirmation of my worth, a reminder that resilience and patience hold more power than confrontation. In its secrecy, it taught me something else. The best victories are often unseen by those who doubt you the most. They notice only what they are willing to see, while the real change happens quietly, without announcement, inside your own life. I started noticing other truths around the house, little hypocrisies and inconsistencies that had always been there, but had been invisible to my younger self. Complaints about finances, casual dismissals of my contributions, subtle criticisms framed as concern, all of it had been part of a larger pattern. And yet, in these observations, I found clarity. I realized that their judgments said more about their own fears and insecurities than about me. Their disbelief was a reflection of limitations, not a measure of my potential. When I finally told my best friend about the acceptance, it was with a quiet, measured joy, not a triumphant announcement. Her excitement was mirrored in my own calm pride, a soft but deep satisfaction that did not require anyone else's approval. And that, I realized, was the difference. Happiness and achievement are not amplified by recognition from the wrong people. They are multiplied when you know, within yourself, that you did it. Weeks passed, life at home continued in its usual rhythms, conversations, dinners, casual routines, but something had shifted. I had shifted. The quiet confidence I carried was no longer tentative. I no longer felt the need to justify my choices or defend my ambitions. I had seen through observation and silence, through small, careful acts of persistence, that I was capable of more than anyone in that house had imagined. And I was learning that dignity does not need applause, and strength does not need recognition. One evening, I placed the acceptance letter back into the drawer where I kept my most precious things, safe and untouched. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder, a talisman of all I had endured, all I had persisted through, and all I had quietly achieved. And in that quiet act, I felt a serenity I had never known, a sense of peace that came not from proving anyone wrong, but from proving myself right. By the time the new semester began, I had learned something invaluable. Strength is not always loud, and victory does not need witnesses. I had carried my acceptance letter quietly, nurtured it privately, and allowed it to guide me without fanfare. And now, as I prepared to leave home for the first time as an adult pursuing my own path, I understood that leaving would not be an act of revenge. It would be an act of self-respect. The mornings before my departure were calm. I packed my things slowly, carefully, folding clothes and arranging books with deliberate care. My stepmom hovered, offering last-minute advice, trying to pepper conversation with small compliments she might have withheld over the years. I smiled softly, thanked her politely, but said nothing about the letter, nothing about the months of preparation, the sacrifices, the silent triumphs. There was no need. She would see, in time, if she chose to notice. I walked through the house one last time, observing everything, the framed pictures on the walls, the small imperfections in the furniture, the little quirks that had once annoyed me but now seemed simply human. I realized that my life here had been both a cage and a classroom. The house had taught me lessons in patience, in quiet observation, and in understanding the complex ways people protect themselves with words and masks, and I had learned to protect myself in the same way, but with grace instead of bitterness. The drive to the university was filled with a serene anticipation. For the first time in years, I felt entirely in control of my destiny, unburdened by the need for approval, unshaken by doubt cast by others. I thought of the nights spent studying while others laughed or criticized, of the quiet victories that no one acknowledged, and I allowed myself a soft, private smile. Every struggle had led to this moment, every insult and dismissal had shaped my resilience, and every quiet act of persistence had built the foundation for the life I was now entering. When I arrived, I walked across the campus with the same calm attention I had learned at home, observing, absorbing, taking each step deliberately. The university was large, bustling, full of possibilities, and yet I did not rush. I allowed myself to take it all in, recognizing that my path had been earned through patience and careful planning, not through shouting or demanding recognition. Weeks passed. I settled into my classes, met professors, and began to immerse myself in studies that excited me in ways I could scarcely describe. The world here was different, full of people who valued diligence, curiosity, and initiative, but even in this new space, I carried with me the lessons of home. I had learned to trust myself, to measure my own worth, and to remain calm in the face of judgment. I had learned that dignity is its own reward. Occasionally, I thought of my family, of my stepmom's laughter, of the disbelief that had once weighed heavily on me. But those thoughts were no longer sharp or painful. They were distant, almost neutral, like memories of a season long past. I did not wish them ill, nor did I seek recognition or apology. The quiet consequences of their own choices were unfolding naturally, and I understood that my own peace was the true victory. One afternoon, as I sat under a tree on campus, opening a textbook for the 100th time that week, I allowed myself to reflect. I realized that life's lessons are often delivered gently, through observation and time, rather than in loud confrontations or dramatic moments. The acceptance letter, once a secret, had been more than a document. It had been a symbol of my ability to persevere without validation, to cultivate strength quietly, and to carry my dignity intact. I understood now, more deeply than ever, that boundaries, respect, and self-respect are cultivated internally. They are not granted by those who doubt you, and they are not dependent on recognition from anyone else. They exist in the quiet decisions we make, the resilience we nurture, and the calm clarity with which we move through the world. That evening, I wrote a short letter to myself, tucking it into my journal. I did not send it to anyone. I did not need anyone else to read it. I simply acknowledged my journey, the pain endured, the lessons learned, and the quiet triumphs that had brought me here. And as I closed the journal, a gentle serenity settled over me, a calm that comes not from winning an argument, but from knowing you have honored yourself fully, and that your life is now truly your own. And in that quiet, intentional space, I finally felt free.